Welcome to the Bench Report, where we discuss topics debated on the benches of the UK Parliament. We aim to make politics more accountable and accessible, talking about issues that impact us all, whether personally or professionally.
Right.
You know, politics is everyone's business.
It really is.
And that's why we're here today to do a deep dive into the upcoming spring statement.
The spring statement.
Yeah, it's happening on March 26, 2025. And this is a crucial moment
It is.
to kind of check in on the government and see if they're actually meeting their own financial targets, which are known as the fiscal rules.
That's right. The fiscal rules. All important fiscal rules.
Yes. And to help us break down everything we need to know about this, we have a detailed briefing from the House of Commons Library.
A great resource.
It is. It really is. And it breaks down what's happened since the last big financial announcement, which was the Autumn Budget 2024, what to expect in the spring statement, and what could happen afterwards.
Yeah, and what could happen afterwards.
Yeah.
This is going to be interesting.
It is. So think of this deep dive as your personal guide to understanding the forces shaping the UK economy and public finances.
We're going to try to cut through that jargon and, make it understandable.
Absolutely.
Accessible for everyone.
Okay. So let's start by talking about what has been happening on the global stage since the autumn budget that could have an effect here at home.
Well, one of the biggest things that has happened is the return of the Trump administration in the U.S.
Right.
This has definitely sent ripples across the globe, particularly when it comes to international trade. We've seen the reintroduction of tariffs, which of course creates instability. But what's really interesting is how this has become intertwined with international security.
I see.
You see Trump's changing stance towards Russia and his criticisms of NATO have prompted European nations, including the UK, to reassess their defense spending.
So a change in U.S. foreign policy has a direct influence on budget considerations right here in the UK.
Absolutely. And the briefing highlights that the UK, along with its European allies, is increasing its defense budget in response.
So that's how these things connect, I see.
It is all interconnected.
Now, what about the domestic picture? How's the UK economy been doing?
Well, since mid-2024, the UK economy has seen some modest GDP growth.
Modest, okay.
Modest, yes. However, we are seeing a weakening of business sentiment.
Why is that? What's behind that dip in confidence?
Well, there are a few factors at play. Businesses are a little uneasy about the upcoming tax increases.
Right.
Specifically, the higher employers' national insurance contributions, which are coming in April 2025. And then there's the above-inflation rise in the minimum wage also kicking in April.
So businesses are facing pressure from both sides.
Exactly. And all of this means the Office for Budget Responsibility, or OBR as we'll call them.
The OBR?
Yes, they're likely to revise their GDP growth forecast for 2025 downwards.
So less optimistic than before.
It seems so, yes.
Now, what about the government's strategy for growth? What are they doing to address these challenges?
Well, they've been focusing on speeding up infrastructure project approvals, increasing house building, and trying to make regulations less burdensome for businesses.
So a focus on long-term solutions.
Yes, aiming to boost the economy over time.
Okay,
Yeah.
And before we jump into the spring statement, can we just recap the key points of the autumn budget?
Sure. So in the autumn budget, the Chancellor announced increases in overall government spending. This spending was to be funded through a combination of tax increases and additional borrowing. And they plan to allocate this increased spending to both day-to-day operational costs of public services.
So things like keeping the lights on.
Exactly. And to longer-term investments in infrastructure and other projects.
Okay. So the money's going to two main buckets.
Right. And the primary source of this new revenue was supposed to be the rise in employers' national insurance contributions.
Right. Those national insurance contributions that we talked about.
Yes, precisely.
Okay. That gives us a good foundation. Now let's really dive into the spring statement. Why is this March 26th announcement so important?
Well, the spring statement is basically the Chancellor's formal response to the updated economic and public finance forecasts.
Okay.
These forecasts come from the OBR, and they'll be released that same day, March 26th.
So the OBR gives the diagnosis, and the Chancellor prescribes the medicine.
You could see it that way, yes.
Yeah.
The OBR is like the independent fiscal watchdog.
Right.
And they'll be assessing whether the government is on track to meet their own financial goals, those fiscal rules we talked about.
And they are looking specifically at the financial year 2029-30.
Correct. That's right.
So while the autumn budget is where we see new policy initiatives, the spring statement is more of a checkup.
That was the general idea, yes. The autumn budget is for big announcements, and the spring statement is for responding to the OBR's forecast.
Like a mid-year review.
Exactly.
But there's some speculation that we might actually see some spending and even tax announcements in this spring statement.
That's what's got people talking. There's a growing sense that this might not be a quiet spring statement.
Why is that?
Yeah.
Why the shift in expectations?
It all comes down to those fiscal rules. Remember how I said they were forecast to be met by a pretty narrow margin back in the autumn?
Yes, a tight squeeze.
Exactly. With the economic data being less favorable since then, there's worry the government might miss these targets if they don't take action.
And the government has repeatedly stated its commitment to meet the fiscal rules at all times.
They have, haven't they?
Yeah, so it sounds like the Chancellor might need to make some adjustments in this spring statement to stay on course.
It's certainly a possibility. They need to maintain credibility and show they are being fiscally responsible.
So remind us again, what are these fiscal rules exactly?
Right, so the UK has two main fiscal rules. The first is the current budget rule.
Yeah.
This rule basically says that the government's day-to-day spending compared to its revenue should be in surplus by the financial year 2029-30.
So they shouldn't be borrowing for day-to-day expenses, only for long-term investments.
Exactly. It's a fundamental principle of responsible budgeting.
And what's the second rule?
The second rule is a bit more complex. It's the Public Sector Net Financial Liabilities Rule, or PSNFL for short.
PSNFL, got it.
This rule states that the total amount of the government's financial obligations minus its assets should be falling as a proportion of the economy by 2029-30.
So it's about managing the overall debt burden.
Precisely. PSNFL is a broader measure of government debt than what's usually reported as public sector net debt.
So PSNFL is the big picture view of all the government's IOUs.
You could say that, yes.
You mentioned that the margin for meeting these rules was quite narrow in the autumn forecast.
Yeah.
What makes it so likely that they might be missed now?
Well, the October 2024 forecast from the OBR showed a projected surplus of only about $9.9 billion for the current budget rule.
$9.9 billion. That doesn't sound like a lot.
It's not huge when you consider the total government spending is in the trillions.
Right, so a small slip up and they could be in trouble.
Exactly. And the PSNFL rule was only forecast to be met by a margin of 0.5% of GDP, which is about $15.7 billion.
Still not a lot of wiggle room.
Not really. And since then, we've seen economic indicators like inflation being higher than expected.
Which could put pressure on those margins.
Absolutely. And it could also slow down economic growth, which would reduce tax revenues and potentially lead to increased government spending in certain areas.
So a bit of a double whammy.
Yes. And that's why the government might need to take some action in the spring statement.
Okay, so let's talk about those potential actions. What levers can the Chancellor pull to make sure they meet these fiscal rules?
Well, if they need to increase the headroom, as they call it.
The margin by which they meet the rules.
Yes, they have two main options for the current budget rule. They can either cut day-to-day spending or increase tax revenue.
So less spending or more taxes.
Right.
Okay, let's start with spending. Where might the government look to make cuts?
Well, the Chancellor has most control over departmental spending.
The money that goes to the various departments.
Exactly. And these are governed by departmental expenditure limits, or DELs.
DELs.
These DELs were set during the spending review, and they cover things like public services, grants to organizations, administrative costs, all that. Now, the spending review outlined spending plans up to 2028-29, and the plan was for spending to increase rapidly in the short term, but then slow down significantly in the later years.
Okay, so they were front-loading the spending.
You could put it that way, yes.
And if they need to make further cuts to meet those fiscal rules?
Well, they could reduce the amounts allocated to departments in those later years.
But that's easier said than done, right?
It is, because a lot of government spending is considered protected.
Like the NHS and defense.
Exactly. Those are usually priorities. So if those areas are shielded, any cuts would likely fall more heavily on other, less protected departments.
So some tough decisions might need to be made.
For sure.
What about welfare spending? That's another big chunk of government expenditure.
It is, and interestingly, the government has actually just put forward some pretty significant proposals for welfare reform.
Oh, really?
Yes, particularly touting disability benefits. They published a green paper on March 18th, outlining potential changes.
A green paper? What's a green paper?
It's a way for the government to get feedback on policy options before they make any firm decisions.
Ah, so testing the waters.
Exactly. And their aim with these reforms is to save around £5 billion by 2029-30.
$5 billion? That's a lot of money. What kind of changes are they proposing?
Well, one of the biggest is a potential overhaul of the Personal Independence Payment, or PIP, assessment.
Okay.
They're suggesting changes to how people qualify for the daily living component of PIP.
I see.
They also want to abolish the Work Capability Assessment, which determines eligibility for other incapacity benefits, and link eligibility for the Universal Credit Health element more closely to PIP.
So essentially streamlining the process.
You could see it that way, yes.
Okay. No, what?
Well, there's talk of freezing and then reducing the value of the Universal Credit Health element for some claimants, but at the same time, they're proposing to increase the standard allowance of universal credit.
So it's a bit of a give and take.
It is. They're also considering a new premium for people with the most severe health conditions and potentially delaying when young people can access the Universal Credit Health element.
And one last thing they mentioned was a new time-limited unemployment insurance benefit?
Yes, that's another idea they're floating.
Wow. So some pretty significant changes to the welfare system could be on the horizon.
It's definitely a major development, and it's interesting that these proposals came out so close to the spring statement.
Now let's shift gears and talk about the other option, increasing tax revenue. What can the Chancellor do on that front?
Well, raising taxes is always a touchy subject, and the current government made specific promises in their manifesto about taxes.
What did they promise?
They pledged not to increase income tax, national insurance contributions, or VAT.
So those big tax levers are off the table.
At least according to their promises.
Right.
But the briefing does point out that there are other ways to increase tax revenue.
Like what?
Well, one option is extending the current freeze on personal tax thresholds.
The income tax personal allowance and the higher rate threshold.
Those are the ones that have been frozen since 2021 and are currently set to stay that way until 2028. But extending the freeze even further, perhaps to cover the financial years, 2028-29 and 2029-30, could generate a lot of extra money.
How so?
Through something called fiscal drag.
Fiscal drag? What is that?
It's when wages rise due to inflation, but tax thresholds stay the same.
So more of your income becomes taxable, even if the rates haven't changed.
Exactly. It's a sneaky way to increase the overall tax burden.
I see. So even without breaking their promise of not raising tax rates, the government could still collect more taxes.
Exactly. And estimates suggest extending these freezes could bring in billions of pounds by 2029-30.
Wow. So those frozen thresholds are a powerful tool.
They are?
The briefing also mentioned defense spending and overseas aid. What role did they play in all of this?
Well, the government recently announced that they're going to accelerate their plan to increase defense spending to 2.5% of GDP by 2027. And to help pay for this, they're cutting the overseas aid budget from 0.5% to 0.3% of gross national income.
So shifting money from one pot to another.
Right. Now, this doesn't change the total amount of spending, but it could actually help them meet the current budget rule.
How so?
Because defense spending usually involves more investment or capital expenditure compared to overseas aid. And capital spending isn't included when calculating the current budget deficit or surplus.
So it's a bit of an accounting trick.
In a way, yes.
Interesting. Now, the Prime Minister has also hinted at potentially raising defense spending to 3% of GDP in the next parliament.
He has. But that's beyond the scope of the current forecast and wouldn't impact the 2029-30 fiscal rules.
Right. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about what's led up to the spring statement, what the purpose of the statement is, what the fiscal rules are, and what actions the government could potentially take. Now, what happens immediately after the Chancellor delivers this statement on March 26th?
Well, as soon as the Chancellor is done, the OBR will publish their full economic and fiscal outlook.
The detailed report with all the data.
Yes, it's the basis for everything the Chancellor announced.
Okay.
Then the Shadow Chancellor will respond on behalf of the opposition.
Right.
And unlike the autumn budget, there aren't usually any further debates in Parliament immediately after the spring statement.
So it's a one-day event.
Pretty much, yes.
And what about further down the line? What should people be looking out for?
Well, one big event is the conclusion of Phase 2 of the spending review on June 11th, 2025. That's when they'll finalize the spending limits for government departments up to 2028-29.
So more details to come.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then as we move into the new financial year in April 2025, several changes we've already discussed will come into effect.
What's this stuff?
Well, the increase in employers' national insurance contributions, the freeze on income tax and national insurance thresholds, adjustments to business rates relief, inflation-linked benefits and tax credits will go up by 1.7%.
And what about the state pension?
That's getting a bigger increase of 4.1%.
Okay.
Oh, and there will be significant increases to the national minimum wage across all age groups.
So quite a lot happening in the next few months.
It's going to be a busy time.
So as you can see, the spring statement is more than just numbers on a page.
It is.
It's about the choices our government makes, the targets they set, and how those decisions impact all of us.
And how they ripple through the economy.
Exactly. So mark your calendars for March 26th.
And keep an eye out for that OBR forecast.
Yes, and the Chancellor's response.
It'll give you a clearer idea of where the UK's finances are headed and what policy changes might be coming.
Absolutely. Well, we hope this deep dive has been helpful.
We hope it sheds some light on these complex issues.
This information debated in Parliament is everyone's business after all.
It is.
So please subscribe to the Bench Report.
Don't miss out.
Yes, because politics is everyone's business.